Well, welcome back, everyone, to another session of Mike and Darren Unplugged. It's been a while. Various things have stood in the way of our contributions, but we're back, and I have for Mike a new topic that's been puzzling me, and that is neologisms. I've heard in the last several years a variety of new locutions, of new phrases, of new words, and they're curiouser and curiouser. Some of them I don't know what to make of. Some of them seem strange and amusing, and some seem, frankly, like they're not very good signs. So, given that, especially in high cultural work, words are our tools, and we think in words and we think in language. Understanding the words we use and the words that are newly minted is important for us to understand each other, to express ourselves. So I thought we'd explore some of these neologisms, perhaps tonight, perhaps for several nights, because they seem to be mushrooming. And so I thought I'd warm us up with one that I find very quaint, and then turn it over to Mike, because I'm sure you've got plenty you've been noting. The one I find most strange is something called lived experience. I never heard that locution more than 2 or 3 years ago, but people now speak to their lived experience, or speak of their lived experience, or invoke their lived experience. So I've thought about it a little bit, because at first it just seems like another version of personal experience, right? One's lived experience is one's personal experience. And if we were to try to define that locution referentially, it would be identical to personal experience. Every lived experience is a personal experience. Every personal experience is a lived experience. So at one level, you can say, well, this is just dopey American media, advertising, and academia, which is they constantly reinvent the wheel and try to get a Nobel Prize for it. But the more I look at it, it actually works differently. So let me just open this, show you how I see these terms being played in a Wittgensteinian language game. So personal experience. I'm talking to Mike, and I say to Mike, I've been reading here that the Ford Focus seems to be having a lot of problems with its automatic transmission after about 50,000 miles. Now, in the locution or the usage of the locution personal experience, a perfectly appropriate answer would be, that may well be so, but in my personal experience, the Ford Focus automatic transmission is just fine. I own one, and I've had one for 70,000 miles, and I've not had nary a problem with it. Now, if we step back and look at that, the personal experience qualifies the overall claim. It suggests that it's not universal, but in no way challenges it or undermines it, since your personal experience is anecdotal and it's a data point of one. It may well be true that your car is flawless in that regard. That doesn't mean that the other pattern is true. And you might get a response from Darren saying something like, well, now that you mention it, it actually said that only about 30% of the cars have this problem, but the industry standard's around 6%. And so, there we go. The personal experience helped us narrow our discussion. But the personal experience doesn't vitiate experience more broadly, data more broadly, facts more broadly. And very often the personal experience is just a reason to personalize the conversation and maybe talk about, oh, what color is your Ford Focus, and get off the general topic. I don't think that's what's going on with lived experience. I think when someone invokes lived experience, it's meant to be authoritative, such that it trumps all other data. So, I mean, I've always found hikes in the woods to be refreshing. Yeah, well, in my lived experience, it's a place of danger and a zone of, and at that point, there's no qualifying. It's not like someone said, well, in my personal experience, I'm actually kind of afraid of critters, but that doesn't undermine my claim. My lived experience, I think, is meant as a cudgel to silence my claim, but maybe I'm reading that wrong. What's your sense of it?
Well, what would unlived or non-lived experience be like?
Right. Well,
Right.
that would
It adds
actually,
nothing to the meaning. right?
Right.
If you were to just say experience, it would mean the same thing, but they would not be defending their essence because, well, sometimes people have experiences that are unusual and do not reflect the general run of
Right.
experiences. And that's just the way the world is. So, lived experience is actually just a way of saying, I am infallible. No one can contradict me about this. And the reason why is because if you do, that's, well, here's the word that I want to jump to. That's violence.
Okay. Well,
No,
let's by all means let's turn to I think you're right. I mean, I will grant a distinction between the experience of an individual and the more broad experience of, say, historical all evidence is experiential.
Yeah.
But we would say, sure, there were the experiences of the Black Plague, et cetera, et cetera. Your personal experience, something you can particularly say, this occurred to me. But as you say, it's not a trump card personal experience, because it's unique in your own. And the fact there's a certain politeness involved in personal experience when I cite my personal experience in contradistinction to some general piece of information or claim. In a healthy language game, a polite one doesn't gainsay my personal experience. One says, by all means, of course, you were lucky, you got the good focus. And I've no doubt that you're not prevaricating with me about your automatic transmission. You're not one of those people that really had a manual and is trying to fool me. But we can do that because the stakes are relatively low. I can stipulate, or you can I can stipulate your strange good luck with the Ford Focus transmission, precisely because not a heck of a lot hangs on it. But when I give you that stipulation and then you turn it to have something that hangs a lot on it, you violated the rules of the game. And then at some point you're tempting me to say, you know what, I don't believe you. I don't believe you did have that lived experience. If you're going to use it to trump general conversation, it's a trump card you can play at any given time. You can't escape the laws of gravity. Well, not in my lived experience. Well, I mean, I have alternative ways of knowing, and I've been ethereal. So, that's a minor clarification.
Lived experience is simply putting on the verbal armor of infallibility. Nowadays, whenever I hear somebody tell me about their lived experience, I just tell them that my lived experience is exactly the opposite.
And that's the problem. It's a conversation
now, because I'm tired of listening to this self-indulgent crap.
But you see the contrast there. That's why although it's coterminous with personal experience, the exact same things, it's used in the opposite way. When you say, in my personal experience, blah, 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 and you say, well, my personal experience has been just the opposite, that's not grounds for conflict. That's grounds for a really interesting exchange. Well, tell me about that. Oh, really? So it was good for you and it was bad for me. Well, maybe there's some extraneous factor. But when it becomes the lived experience, and I don't know what it has to be that way, but it seems that's the way it's played, it's a cudgel. As you say, it's the infallibility. It's like you can't deny my experience. Well, no one would be tempted to deny it if you didn't use it as a universal authority.
You see, they're entitled to that because of the fact that they have aggregated to themselves a superiority based upon perspective.
But that's true. Yeah, absolutely. But that's true of every lived experience. I mean, that's the problem. It's the war of all against all. If someone says, "Well,"
on the desk, it adds nothing to the seriousness of the claim.
And all it does is eventually invite counterpounding.
Well, yeah. And then I say that I'm offended by the fact that you're offended. We're all offended. Now, what do you want to do? Being offended is not an argument, and you're going to have to grow up and learn to live with that.
Yeah. All right. Let's turn to violence. I'm sorry. I've locked this up on this.
Violence has a literal meaning, which is causing trauma to other people or to other things.
Right.
And it also has a
Truth,
metaphorical lack of
truth.
meaning.
Let me add one qualifier. I think that's right, but you left a key word out, and it may be that
Okay.
this linguistic miasmas may have infected your brain. It also involves a physical act.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Thank
I
you.
assume
Okay.
that to be the case. In other words, violence literally is one body injuring another with or without the use of an implement.
Right. Well said. Okay.
Okay. So that's what happens when you are the victim of violence.
Right.
Everything else is just your hurt feelings. And the problem is, it is not the people's job or the government's job to supervise the vagaries of your feelings. The government exists to prevent real violence, not metaphorical violence, which can be used to refer to absolutely anything anybody else does. So instead of having everyone become more sensitive, I have to admit I am sick to death of sensitivity, empathy, and God help us, self-esteem, that I'm inclined to say, look, don't weaponize empathy. Save it for the times when it really deserves to be deployed. And the fact that your feelings were hurt by the fact that someone said something you didn't like or talked about you in a way you didn't like, do get over it, because this infinite sensitivity is not it's not an advance. It's not an improvement on human nature. It's a deformity. It's a psychological defect. It's the inability to cope with a world that refuses to do what perhaps a generation of helicopter parents, in fact, did step in and do.
Well, I think that's very apt, because it strikes me that and I assume what you're referring to is the attempt to claim that certain forms of speech are violence.
Also, silence is violence.
Well, that's
So
curious too. Speech is violence and non-speech is violence. So the only thing that isn't violent is saying the proper things.
Right.
And since we can't always know what that is, we should consult someone's lived experience. Maybe they'll tell you in their lived experience, what are the proper things to say? Because if I don't say them, I'm violent. If I do, I'm violent. I don't want to be violent. I mean, it's the last thing in the world I want to be, isn't it? Necessarily be violent. But no, I think that's what you mentioned about helicopter is significant, because when you're a child, your feelings, your sense of ego is still being developed. And so being ridiculed hurts in a very tangible psychological way and can make one cry. And when that happens to a child, we do sympathize with that child and we empathize with that child. When that happens later in life, unless it's under very extreme circumstances, one until quite recently would have said, if one says, well, I mean, I can't take this, these words are hurting me, one would normally say, you're not 6, right? You outgrew that stage, right? I mean, of course you find words disturbing. Of course you do. Of course you disagree with things that are said. Someone says, I find this speaker, hurtful. I mean, I understand that. My goodness, I grew up having to listen to Imagine by John Lennon. I didn't cry about it. I mean, I find it distasteful. It's like listening to Joan Baez. People have their tastes, but for me, that's, silence would be preferable. But if someone wants to play Joan Baez, I'm not going to get all bent out of shape about it. It's tastes vary.
Hypersensitivity has been selected out for, and also gross stupidity has prospered more than in most circumstances. If I could give an example,
please.
So I read, I don't remember where it was, but it was in the last couple of months. Somebody said that part of the problem we have is that growing up, a whole generation, or perhaps more than a generation, has been protected from the painful consequences of bad decisions. And while that's understandable, I tried to do that with my children. I think that every responsible parent does. But on the other hand, from the non-lethal, non-serious, painful outcomes,
Yeah,
there is actually an educative element in that,
yeah.
uh, because the reason why stupid prospers now, or at least part of it, is because earlier on, stupid didn't hurt. Stupid should hurt. But right. So people think, well, stupid's okay. It doesn't really hurt. And eventually they may find out differently. But there's a reasonable amount of caution, what you might call an Aristotelian golden mean in raising children. We may have gone a bit to the protective side of that golden mean. And the outcome may be excessively sensitive young people.
I think that may be true. It may also be true of adults in that adults are still being raised in the cocoon of various media, and they certainly speak this therapeutic language of care and tenderness and sensitivity, and so it may be that it's not just the kids. I think the kids suffer from it the worst, and I say suffer literally because those kids who are taught not to be aggressive or linguistically violent in their thought.
Linguistic violent in their thought. All
Right, which is not only don't say the wrong things, don't even think them, get them out of your head.
Yeah.
Doesn't change the fact that Homo sapiens is an apex predator, and it has those aggressive urges, and you're not sublimating them. You're not redirecting them and challenging them into chess or boxing or debate or high cultural work. You're literally trying to squash them. Yeah. It's like a balloon. It's going to come out at the ends. And it's, what you're going to wind up with is what we used to call in college compassion fascism, right? This incredible kindness, which is actually suffocating and cruel.
So it's self-righteous, as though I have had the glyph of moral reality revealed to me, and that's hard to take from anybody, but it's really insufferable from 20-year-olds. I mean, I'm thinking, my God, you are serious about this, and the idea that finally people understand right and wrong, and have the capacity for disinterested goodness that the world has never possessed before. I don't even know where to begin explaining the reality of that.
Well, but here's the thing. I think young people, at least since the advent of this very long romantic age we've been in, have had that tendency. I mean, that's been but there's been a useful corrective, which was they would certainly be, we are the change agent, we understand, but they were not taught to be coddled, which is to say their elders would say to them, well, when you've walked a little bit on the beaches of Normandy with shells coming at you, come back and tell me about how much wisdom you have about the universe. And when you looked at the consequences of your actions, before you fix our global climate, as Jordan Peterson has said, how's your room? You got it clean and tidy? You got all that homework done? So the fact that you had that check back meant that normal, and I think just in some ways healthy, instinct on the part of young people would get that pushback, and they would take those two and integrate it into an adult self. Without that pushback, you never get to the adult self. You become a permanent adolescent, and now adolescence can be kind of a permanent childhood. And that's the weird thing is, I mean, it's really hard to explain this to young people because, I'm deeply sympathetic to them, but it's like childhood's a great period, adolescence a great period. But here's the thing, we tell you how great they are when you're going through them because it's like you have to get through this and it's having your teeth pulled. Adulthood is the fun time. I mean, you're a bundle of neuroses and rage in your childhood and adolescence. And until you domesticate it and control it, and that comes from getting that pushback and integrating it so that you interface with society in a way, in your culture, in a way that's mutually productive. The anxiety you feel before you've achieved that, I'm not surprised that there's this really high prevalence of suicidal ideation I mean, I
Yeah.
remember adolescence. It wasn't fun. You want to get through that, get out of that. It's necessary to grow. You have to go through that pain. But the idea that you shouldn't feel that pain then, no, that's why you're in it, to get the pain so it'll drive you out into a more mature and complete sense of self. So,
That's a real good point. In other words, pain is often an evil, but it's not always an evil, and it's certainly not the greatest evil. So if people orient their lives towards accumulating pleasure, they get all Epicurean, and they're likely to find many ways of satisfying that, those heterogeneous impulses, particularly given the internet. But it's going to leave them in a bad psychic state. It's going to leave them depleted, and it's going to leave them with an impoverished life in the real world. So I do worry about the difficulty for young people to find a focus, to find something worth committing to, without committing to something to the level of Gnostic fanaticism. In other words, well, I mean,
I know what you mean.
There's a proper degree of commitment before you start burning witches or burning heretics. And that's what I think is lacking, a sense of proportion. And
I think that's right.
It's a hard thing to teach.
Oh, I agree. And I think it's not just, I mean, you've raised it at a larger cultural and social level. I just like kids. I have to confess, that's why I was a college professor. I still, even when they're weird, I still like them. And I feel for them at a very personal level, which is to say, you're so sensitive like that you're never going to get through life. Here's the thing. We're all going to be exposed to things that we don't like, and some of them we really loathe and despise, and that's the human condition. And if that's going to ruin your life and ruin your happiness and make you feel uncomfortable being alive and you're thinking about suicide, boy, your nerves are shot. I mean, they're just shot. You gotta get a little tougher than that. You've got to be able to roll with that. So I do agree that metaphor of speech as a form of violence is not only dangerous politically and socially, but I worry not just for the damage that they do to others. I worry about the damage they do to themselves. These are not horrible people, and they've been led to a place where they're, as much pain as they're putting out on others, they're putting more on themselves. And if they ever do become adults, what will they think of what they did in their late adolescence? I mean, part of being an adult is thinking back all the really stupid things you did before you were an adult, and acknowledging and carrying, but also carrying it with it's a certain burden of regret. Like, boy, I shouldn't have done that. But that's how you grow. And I think that I fear that's, if not precluded, at least more difficult under those circumstances.
Yeah, I think you're right. If you want growth in a spiritual sense, it doesn't come easy and doesn't come cheap. Dostoevsky said that suffering is the origin of all consciousness. That might be true, but it's certainly an interesting and provocative way to look at it. It's connected to Job's problem in the Bible of why evil exists. And damned if I know. The closest I can come is to say that it gives the good something to do.
Right. Or it is what it is. I mean, we make the best of what we can do. Right. Exactly.
Maybe I think Job gets it right when he says, why don't I put my hand over my mouth and just shut up and take it?
I repent in dust and ashes. I repent in dust and ashes. Absolutely. That's the beginning of wisdom, as the great sage Clint Eastwood said in one of the Dirty Harry movies. He always had like a moral or a maxim for the movie that he would repeat twice. And one of them, I think it was the one dealing with death squads in San Francisco.
Oh, Magnum Force.
Oh, you're good, Mike. And the line there was, a good man knows his limits. And that's right. I mean, it really is the essence of a good man. Know your limits, because we all have them. But let me throw another one at you because time is running on and we have a long list. We'll no doubt come back and do
Yep.
more. So this is another phrase I've heard originally just in the academy, and there it was just funny and cute, but now increasingly in our political and public discourse. And that's the term inclusivity, that we want to be inclusive. And when I first heard it, I was like, okay, this is administrative marketing nonsense, because we're certainly not inclusive in the university. We don't want to hire stupid. We don't want to include incompetent. We don't in physics include flat earth theory, or in biology include Lamarck.
So what if all those exclusions are hegemonic?
They are. I mean, that's the point. Okay, so any case, but my point is, even the people who claim to speak for inclusivity can't tell you what it means. If they say, look, we want to be inclusive, you ask, well, inclusive of what? Of all voices. Okay, so we're going to be in, say, an academic community, we want to be inclusive of all voices. Okay, so you're going out and you're recruiting Pentecostalists? No, you're not. Are you going out and recruiting to hear from them? Domestic extremists?
Yep.
No, you're not. So you're clearly not inclusive.
Yes.
So what is it you're trying to say? You want to include something, but you're not willing to say what it is out loud because it might sound funny, or better yet, and this I think is the truth, because you don't know. You have a feeling
an
like
ad hoc collection of heterogeneous things. Can you offer something to an electoral coalition? Well, then we can add this too. Left-handed bird watchers, absolutely. You're oppressed, and we're going to have a special left-handed day during bird watching week, and you'll get your proper recognition.
Okay, but even if we limit it to the oppressed, or leave the oppression out of it, inclusion can't be unlimited, right? Because if you want to include lovers of birds, you're not going to also include bird hunters, right? If you want to include voices that have been marginalized, then you're certainly going to exclude voices that have been
schizophrenics.
Yeah, what's the opposite of marginalized? Centralized? Because that's another, I don't know what marginalized means either, but we'll leave that for another day. That's a biggie. But all of that inclusivity talk, it strikes me as it's invoked when, and at least in the college experience, it's invoked when the administration wants to do something that the faculty and students don't want done, and says, don't look at that, look at this. We have an initiative over here for inclusivity, and some of my friends are going to get hired to run it. And what it'll do is just talk about inclusivity. In the meantime, I've just raised your tuition and cut your salary.
Well, we're going to implement inclusivity too. We're not just going to talk about it.
Well, we're going to implement it, and this is another one that I like very much, in a transparent fashion. Now, what the hell does transparency mean?
Transparent bureaucracy is a contradiction in terms.
And I want to be fully transparent. Well, first of all, you couldn't be fully transparent with me because we don't even know what's going on inside of ourselves very often. We're conflicted. That's why we sit down with head shrinkers to help us figure out what are some of our drives are. But the other thing is, when I ask for specific, you see this in government hearings, when they ask for specific information, and the person says, well, I want to be fully transparent, that means I'm not going to give you that information.
Yeah.
Because I don't want full transparency. I want a specific piece of information. So let's talk about the spirit. And again, it is like the inclusivity. It is this Jedi mind trick that is played on people that want to be cooperative and assume that there's some semantic content to it. But I think this is what Frankl talked about when he talked about the rise of bullshit. There really isn't any semantic range to that. I mean, there was actual semantic range to lived experience. It just does nasty work. This is empty. The null set is empty. The transparency is, you're not going to tell me you're not going to be fully transparent with me, Mr. President. You're not going to tell me, what time you go to the bathroom and how that works out for you. And I don't want to know, frankly. I want very specific things. I'll ask you for them and tell me. I don't know what transparency means. And, let's be, it's different than being honest.
Yeah. Right.
And that's what's interesting. One could say, I wish to be honest with you, but they can't do that because they don't want to be.
And it's very evident. Whereas transparent, because it's empty, you can say you're transparent and then move right along while explaining that everybody should in fact pound sand.
Now that we discussed with transparency, okay.
I don't think they put it quite that way, but
no. So what do you got? You got any others?
Right, I got to connect to your point.
Okay.
About diversity. How do you know when things are diverse?
Oh, my goodness.
Unless, again, it has different implications in different contexts.
Yeah.
But I was thinking the case of universities. It seems to be a condition where everyone in a lecture hall looks different and thinks the same. So that no matter where you come from or what sort of chromosomes you got, your ideological account of both American society and politics in general converges upon a narrative of victimization and a narrative of Western destructiveness that is ideologically driven and only, I think, sustainable among those one book leftists for whom, well, they've read one book. It'd be like Hobsbawm or maybe Howard Zinn. And that's what they know about history. And, that tells them all they need to know because it affirms all the things they want to believe. But in fact, history is a lot more complicated than that. And it creates all kinds of difficulties. Look, I don't know about you, but I'm a lifetime Democrat. I registered and never changed. I'm more or less a social Democrat in the sense that I like capitalism with a big welfare state, so things aren't too messed up. That recently became far right wing.
I know you've become a neoliberal fascist.
Yeah, I used to like to, the idea of taking care of the majority of society, people that actually go to work and do stuff. Not anymore. And I'm how can I put it? Immune to the attractions of the lumpen proletariat. Yeah. So, I don't know where that leaves me. I like the old proletariat and I'd like to help them out.
I would say that's a topic for another conversation, but very briefly, that's the division between the old left and the new left.
Yeah.
The old left liked the proletariat. The new left liked what Marx called the lumpen proletariat.
Yeah. But the left moved away from me when they stopped believing in reality.
Well, so this is the leave reality alone for a second. That one scares me. But the diversity thing. So here's the thing. I see the image you're coming up in the classroom, and in the academic setting, it's appropriate. But even there's a shell game going on. They're like, we want diversity, and by which they mean ethno-racial diversity, and gender diversity, and diversity of lifestyles. They say we want that, and in courts they argue that produces a richer academic environment. But it's funny when they say what makes a rich academic environment being diverse, they say it comes from a variety of different perspectives. So one would suggest, if that's the case, that you would want to have not just, say, African Americans, but African Americans of a conservative bent, of a liberal bent, of a nationalist bent, of a socialist bent, all of the above, that if you wanted that rich interplay of voices, you'd want to make sure that you were inclusive, and now I'm not kidding, of Pentecostalists.
Yep.
Right? And making Pentecostal and evangelicals make not a small percentage of our society, right? Larger than almost any minority group, and includes a lot of minority groups. So whenever that locution is displayed, and one says, okay, your argument for it actually makes some sense, and then you say, and this is what you'd have to do, it turns out that's not what they mean at all. So again, in this case, diversity works the same way as transparency and inclusivity, as a Jedi mind trick to distract you, which is really what we want to do is, educate, at least in, I think the Harvard and UNC cases, is really what we want to do is educate a very small group of white elites. We need to surround them with some very bright kids to raise the general IQ of the college, but not that many. And we want to surround them with ethnic minorities because they're going to need to manipulate them to make money the rest of their lives. Well, I'm not so sure that serves anyone. It certainly doesn't serve the advancement of knowledge.
No, what it serves is the advantage of a certain well-placed elite, and that's what's been sustaining this. If they were to eliminate athletic scholarships and actually pay NCAA players, which they should have done long ago, and then let them go to college if they want to, and what they also ought to do is eliminate legacy admissions, and here not just not giving an advantage, I mean not letting them apply. There are at least 24 really good universities in the US. Find one that your dad didn't go to. You will live with that. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah. Well, I didn't mean to divert this to the court case. That was my bad. But
it's okay.
Yeah, just an example. The reason that these locutions are important is because they will be deployed in our public life. And if they don't have any context, they can be used to do anything.
Yeah.
You can get those Orwellian slogans: "Love is hate, peace is war." So that's part of my issue is the diversity. Is that if you meant to say you need cultural diversity to have a richer conversation when you say read Plato's Republic together as a group, then I think what you mean is, yeah, I might want a kid from Detroit, and I also want a kid from Clark County, Kentucky.
Yeah. Right,
in that room to sit next to Chelsea Clinton.
Yeah.
Or wherever the Biden is. And that would actually be an enriching experience, but that's not the game that's being played.
That's right.
Anyway.
Exactly.
Let me do one, and then I think we better sign off, and we'll get back to this. So and we'll return to this one because I know this is one of your favorites. We've talked about it before. And that is the use of what I call verbing, where everything now becomes a verb. So we need to effort our conversation, and I need to compartmentalize my house. And what do you make? I mean, are we really
the
going
most
to break down the distinction?
Thing that happened to words in my lifetime was the emergence of parent as a verb. It used to be that you had father or mother and that you could identify them readily. But then you had parents. Okay, I mean, that's understandable. That's like siblings, a general term. But then people began parenting, and it wasn't necessary to be a parent in order to start parenting. And what that did was detach the verb from the noun in a significant way. I'm not sure that it was good for parents' understanding of themselves.
Yeah. I mean, parenting is just one example. I mean, in some cases, for example, in the business world, if you're a corporate piece of whatever information you want to set out, and you're a technical writer, you want to use as many syllables as possible. So you take a good noun like a compartment, which refers to a space, and instead of saying we need to sort things into the correct categories, you say, well, we'll compartmentalize that. And it looks like you really got something for going to business school for that. So I understand that as a marketing scheme. No, I do. I mean, again, that's the Frankel bullshit thing. And I understand that. I mean, everybody's got a rice bowl to fill. But when it starts spreading beyond that and people start using it, and parenting is a very weird one. I'll effort that tomorrow. one gets the sense it's not so much that they won't parent, that they won't be raise their children well and won't do a good job of parenting. I hope they will. I hope it's nothing to do with that. I fear the rise of a sort of idiocracy there, because we think and speak in words. These are our
baby talk.
tools. It's baby talk. And when you have baby talk, you think like a baby.
Yeah.
And that's so, I think we've probably run our time limit here, but let's think about more verbs for next time and come in.
All right.
And I've
still
still got a list.
We don't like.
Yeah, and I've still got a list of a whole lot of other locutions I can't make heads or tails of that I need your help with.
We'll see what we can do. Good night, Doctor.
All right. Thank you, audience. We will be back with you shortly.
Some other time. Bye-bye.
Bye.